All right, everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about slave culture and resistance. This is the middle second part of the chapter 11 reading. So we talk about the unique slave culture that developed in America in the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, and also how slaves resisted slavery, because they certainly did. All right, let's talk about the way I'm going to frame this is with three key factors that are going to shape the development of a unique slave culture on American plantations and in the American South. Number one, we're going to see a major impact and a major shaping of slave culture by as a consequence of the brutal treatment and the oppressive laws that the slaves were confronted with. So that culture of oppression is going to shape the culture of slaves in America. Also, we're going to take a look at the impact of their African heritage. And as over the years that begins to be watered down and replaced by American Christianity as a culture, we're going to see that there's actually a synthesis of the two on the plantations. We're going to see African traditions kind of carried forward and merged with new kind of American Christian traditions for the slaves. And finally, and this is where we're going to get into resistance and revolt, the slave culture that develops on the plantations is largely the result of and defined by their decision to defy and resist the institution of slavery. The slaves are going to decide to defy and resist the institution of slavery. And so these are not the only factors that help to shape slave culture, but I think these are some important and consequential contextual events and realities that are going to really have an impact on slave culture. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with the treatment of slaves. So obviously it's going to vary from plantation to plantation and from house to house. Most people in the South don't own slaves, right? There are, it's roughly 75% of the Southerners don't own slaves. They're incredibly expensive. They're a major investment. And so it's really the wealthy, the top 25% of Southern society that own slaves. And of those that own slaves at all, it's a very small number that own a large number of slaves on a plantation. Those are the wealthiest of the wealthy, what today we might call the 1%. And it's really on those plantations that we really see the development of slave culture, because there's large groups of slaves that are interacting with one another, as opposed to a single slave in a house in a moderate, a middle class type of situation. All right. So it's going to vary. This treatment is going to vary from plantation to plantation and house to house. But more often than not, the treatment of slaves on these large plantations in particular is going to be characterized by violence, or at least the threat of violence. And if not the threat of physical violence, the threat of sexual violence, the threat or actuality of sexual violence, the threat or actuality of psychological violence, a lot of times with this threat of kind of separating families. So that was one of the biggest fears of slaves on plantations, was that they would be separated from their community, separated from their family, never to see them again, right? And that is a terrifying thought. So this violence that was happening was often done in secret. The slave owners, the plantation owners, did not want to broadcast the way that they were treating the slaves. It was a means of control and oppression, but they also knew that it was one of the things that the abolitionists were most adamant about when it came to the morality of this institution of slavery. And the slave owners like to portray themselves as these benevolent benefactors, right? These benevolent masters who were treating their slaves well. And that was, not often the case. And even when it was the case, they still denied them their freedom. All right. Again, sexual violence is common. And this is really going to shape the culture of slaves in America, because there's going to be a significant number of slaves who are going to bear the children of their masters, right? So this is a strange reality that's going to impact slave culture as well. And again, the psychological violence, this threat of whipping, if not being whipped, this constant hanging over your head of the real possibility of violence, or the possibility of being separated from your family. So these are the things that are shaping slave culture. They have to be secret. They have to be tempered. They have to be close together. They have to really work as a community. We're going to get into that more in a second. Black codes as well are going to really restrict slaves and impact the development of their culture. They will not be allowed to learn how to read and write. They will not be allowed to participate in civic duties and opportunities. No free association. They can't meet up with free Black people. There had been a time in American history where slaves were given some of these freedoms. Maybe you had a day off and you could go visit someone else, but that was very uncommon in the years leading up to the Civil War. So all of these things are going to have a cultural impact on the slaves. There's going to be a lack of literacy, a lack of formal education, and this is going to drive that slave culture in a particular way. Right, it's going to make them more reliant, as we're going to see in a few seconds, on things like oral traditions, storytelling, that sort of stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the second piece, right? The synthesis of cultures. And we're going to really see it in the church. The Black church is going to be the cornerstone of the Black community after the Civil War. But the slaves are holding on to their African identity. They're going to rely on African traditions, spiritual traditions, traditions of family, community, healing traditions. Oftentimes, slaves will be sought out by their masters when they don't know what to do or don't have a doctor to go to, because it was believed that they were going to be able to come in and provide some healing. Also, as we mentioned, largely as a result of that oppression, there was a strong tradition of singing, dancing, and storytelling. As a means of expression, self-expression, when you're really limited and confined in what you can do and who you can be. This is how it poured out of the slave community. Okay, so they're slowly going to be stripped of their African traditions over the years, and those are going to be replaced with Christian traditions. And you're going to see that the slaves are going to blend that traditional religious tradition with Christian tradition. And a lot of where we see this immediately is in their worship services with shouting and singing and African rhythms. It's very different than a traditional Western European, even Protestant gathering, right? And that carries over to this day, right? The Black church is still known for its more energetic and emotionally responsive worship services in the church. Okay, so that's going to have an impact and develop on these plantations. All right, and lastly, and this is where we're gonna end and shift and talk more about this resistance: defiance and resistance. Resistance and defying the institution of slavery was a coping mechanism. It was the limited freedom that slaves could experience was in resisting the institution that was denying them their freedom. And so this kind of defined their culture as well, always looking for ways to defy and to resist this institution and work together in community to do that. The most common forms of resistance were kind of low-level, safe forms of resistance, where they might feign illness, right, so that the plantation is not as productive that day. They might work slowly in the fields. They might break tools to have a negative impact on the economic prosperity of the master. They might run away, right? That was a higher risk category. But they might run away seeking freedom in a new part of the country or the world. Less common was violent revolts, right? But that's not to say the violent revolts didn't happen. We're going to talk about those in a second. But think about how, as a slave and as a community, your interactions with each other and the decisions you make and the actions you take are in large part going to be defined by your resistance and your defiance of the position you find yourself in the world. That is really going to shape slave culture. All right, so let's conclude by talking a little bit about some slave revolts, right? And there were hundreds of slave revolts, very few that were successful. And even those that were successful, and I put that in air quotes because ultimately they're going to be put down, the successful revolts, ultimately they're going to be put down, and the response to those successful revolts is terror and fear and leads to more oppression and more brutal treatment in the South. But historians, there's records you can find of over 300 slave revolts throughout American history. That's from 1619 through the end of slavery. Some of the most significant are the Stono Rebellion of 1739, the New York Conspiracy Trials of 1741, the German Coast Uprising of 1811, a massive revolt that most people haven't heard of, and Nat Turner's Rebellion, which brings us up to the time period that we are studying currently. So what I would like you to do now for my classes is I would like you to look at the playlist, the YouTube playlist that we've provided for you, and I want you to dig a little bit deeper into some of these violent rebellions. Look at least 2 of these 4 videos that I've posted, and we're going to debrief some of these violent slave revolts next time we meet in class. Okay. All right. So there was a lot of things that were impacting the development of a unique slave culture, their history, their African history, their current reality of oppression and brutality, and their defiance and resistance of the institution of slavery. Okay, so we'll pick up with slave revolts, watch those videos, and we'll talk about them in class.